In our first presentation, we were looking at the relationship between the Conservatives and the Liberals. We gave a very sort of simple overview or definition of the two groups. They both read. One puts into practice what they read in a very literal fashion. The other group meditate and think about what they read and they question it. So these people don't question and these people do. Gave some examples. These keep the Sabbath in a very literal fashion. And these keep the principle of the Sabbath. They say no elders because it's instructed that way. And these say, why not? Why can't we have women elders? And you begin to see this difference between the way they approach things. Then we saw our place. And what we have tried to do is distance ourselves from both the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We see that, if you go to the Reformed Line of Christ, that there are these three groups. But if you were to review the Reformed Line of Christ, that history, and you review our own thought processes, our own behaviour, you see that we have this leaning towards Pharisaism because we're so keen upon keeping the law. We want both groups to come and join us. So when a Pharisee comes to join us, what do we want them to do? What change do we demand of them? Do we tell them to keep the law? No. We say you need to get your concepts and your ideas of prophecy correct. So when these Sadducees who don't believe in the law, if they join us, and remember they don't believe in angels, they don't believe in the resurrection, we're going to ask them to correct their mistakes on prophecy. But do we ask them to change their perspective on the law? Or do we say, you can carry on doing what you want? Eat what you want, dress how you want? Is that what we expect of them? Of course not. We expect them to follow the same rules that everyone else is following. So we addressed that issue. Then we saw how easy it is to manufacture information. We saw how FFA, because they have a very strong Pharisaical perspective, they're very conservative. In fact, what the issue that separates us is morality. It's not end-time prophecy. They won't say that at the end of the world, prophecy teaches that women should be elders. Doesn't say that. It doesn't say that anywhere. There's no reading or thus saith the Lord. So they can't understand how this issue can be connected to prophecy. They see it as a moral issue. undermining of God's rules and regulations, his laws. Until recently, the issue of taking medicines was not something that these people would tolerate or accept. Publicly at least. Privately they would. Because that's what most Pharisees do. They live a private life and a public life. I'm sure the people who are laughing at themselves because they know they do that. They're not laughing at FFA. All of us are confronted with these issues. So when the study of nature of man was presented, that clarified these issues, there was a sigh of relief across the whole movement, because the things that people are doing privately, they now no longer needed to be ashamed of. But today, those people who separate from the movement, they go back to a very rigid and stern perspective of many of these reform subjects. And I'm saying that Concord, the increase of knowledge, is ahead of us. But we have to keep in mind that the increase of knowledge is something that is progressive. It's not just a waymark. And therefore, we are already in the increase of knowledge from that perspective. Already from that perspective, yeah? And we should now be able to see here what has happened, what has occurred at November the 9th in this history and moving forward. People want us to just to turn to some external event that occurred. That's a very crude and childish perspective. We don't accuse or attack Future for America when they have nothing for September the 7th, nothing for November the 9th, and nothing for January the 20th. We don't mock them. We just say that they're wrong. Because they know nothing about an external event on November the 9th. And there was no external event on January the 20th. So they try to manufacture information. Now, if you run a thread through their line, you know where this is headed. It's half of 360. Which is 180. Which is July 18th. When this event comes and goes, we will have to make comment then. When their prediction fails. So they have already laid out their perspective. A challenge. Almost a threat. But an empty threat. And the reason it's empty, not because it's wrong, is because who are they threatening? It can't be us. Why? Why can't they come in July and say, we told you so? Why can they not come in at July and say, we told you so? Because what are they saying about us already? They believe that we're tares. Tares. They believe we're tares. We won't translate it. They believe that we're tares. They believe that we're false prophets, foolish virgins. And they believe that we're in the harvest. And our probation closed in this history. So there's already no hope for us. This is what they teach. It's already too late by January the 20th. I don't know if you realise that. I don't know if their followers realise that. The only people that they can now turn to are the Levites and the Nethinims, not us. Because we're the false priests. And our probation has already been settled and closed, finished. So this waymark has no benefit to us. But when it comes and goes, and it fails, we will obviously comment. So that was a recap of what we spoke about this morning. And I did point out the following. God expects us to know who we are and what we're doing at this moment in time. We need to have a self-awareness. The problem is most of us don't. We don't seem to have a self-awareness of who we are. And I want us to hold that thought in our minds as we go through our studies. I want to go to a portion of scripture. One of the brothers was speaking to me during the break, and he pointed out this portion. I thought it was interesting. It's in the book of Acts. Now, Paul is a complicated person, very interesting person. Is he a liberal or a conservative? Paul, what is he, a liberal or a conservative? Conservative? A liberal? So he'll go to the market and he'll say, you can eat meat sacrificed to idols. And you know that's against the law. It's not kosher. So, is that the behavior of a conservative or a liberal? Obviously very liberal. He doesn't seem to have many standards. He says, when you go to Rome, you behave like the Romans do. So if someone invites you to their home and they give you food that you would not normally eat, or they would ask you to eat at a time that you don't normally eat, how should you behave? Should you say, I don't do that kind of thing, or should you just eat it? Come on, a plain reading of his words. You eat, you fit into their way of life. That's what he teaches. It's a very liberal position. The reason I mention that is if you go to the book of Acts, chapter 22. Acts 22. Now in this movement we go to Acts 27 normally. Acts 22. So if you went to the chapter before, you would notice that Paul is going to go to Jerusalem and he wants to help and assist the brethren. When he gets to Jerusalem, his brethren who don't understand the gospel and frankly don't like him. Why don't they like him, by the way? He's too liberal for them. He doesn't have any standards. When he's around the Gentiles, he behaves like a Gentile. So his conservative brethren don't like him. And they're fearful of all the other conservative brethren in Jerusalem. And so they ask him to prove himself. What do they want him to prove? That he's a conservative. So you need to prove you're a conservative. So everyone can know that these accusations are false. Now, was the accusations correct? Yeah, that's the worst thing. The accusation was correct, but they want to pretend that it's all false. You can see all of this in chapter 21. Paul gets captured because he puts himself in harm's way. Let's read verse 24. They tell him to take some people to the temple and do some ceremony. Verse 21. These people have been told that you teach that we should forsake Moses. Is it good to forsake Moses? Who would forsake Moses in this room? No one put their hand up. No one would forsake Moses. About a week and a half ago, I thought nearly everybody in this class forsook him. I said, Deuteronomy 22 verse 5, Moses needs to be forsaken. And no one came back to me and said, what are you saying? It's error. Maybe you believe it, but no one argued with me. So there's this argument that he's forsaken Moses, and so are we. Which prophet speaks about the Sabbath? Saturday, that one. Moses, isn't it? He does it in Exodus and Deuteronomy. So there's this forsaking of Moses that becomes a prophetic issue. A prophetic issue where? When it says, and they are informed. Who are the they? We're in 21:21. Who are the they? Have a read quickly. So put the hand up. Sister Solange? Can't hear you. I don't understand. You've got to speak loud. 8th day? That's who the day is. I want to know who the people are, unless I didn't understand your response. We'll go to the verse before, because we're not sure. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law, and they, who's the they? Jewish who? These are people in the movement, aren't they? Not people in the church. Acts 21:20. They're not people in the church, they're people in the movement. And what are they worried about? That there's this liberal in the church, in the movement, sorry, who's doing what? He's forsaking Moses, breaking the law, and teaching other people to do that. What is it, therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that you are here. Do this thing, verse 23. We have 4 men who have apostatized because they're following the law, which was nailed to the cross. We agree with that? Yay or nay? Take them. You break the law as well. This law of the new covenant. Purify yourself. And then they say you actually have to pay for all of this as well, which I find amazing. And then it says, when they see you doing all of these vows, verse 24, they will be informed concerning thee that all these accusations are not true, and that thou walkest orderly and keepest the law. What does verse 25 say? What does verse 25 say? Someone tell me the relationship between 24 and 25. Anyone? No one can see? "24 says, we, the Jews, have to do what? What did the Jews have to do? Keep the law. We're in chapter 21. "25? What does it say? Sorry? The Gentiles don't have to. So you've got a two-tier church now. Two levels. One standard for one group, one standard for the other. We heard that before? This is a very issue that's confronting this movement. One standard for us, one standard for them. And what did we deal with at the very beginning of our school? What we learn, the Levites must learn, and the Nethinims must learn. There's no difference between them. There's not one rule for us and one rule for them. And people have misunderstood this story. Especially when you go to the Council of Jerusalem story, which is what it's referring to here. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have already written. As concerning the Gentiles, we have already written. And it tells you what they wrote. Basically, they don't have to follow the same rules. And there are people in our movement who believe that. That the Nethinims have a different standard than us. It's the same arguments that they're making here. Does Paul believe that? No, he does not believe that. Does he follow along with them? Yes, he does, and he gets himself into a big trouble. There's a riot. Paul gets put into prison. Then he is going to give his defense. Gets put into prison. And then you get to verse 30, 22:30. In the morning, because he would know the certainty whereof he was accused of the Jews, this is the centurion, he allows Paul to be judged by the Sanhedrin. And chapter 23 is Paul's arraignment before the Sanhedrin. And he has a very interesting technique or methodology here. So they're all together and they're going to accuse him. And by the time you get down to, we'll drop straight down to, in verse 3, because he's disrespectful, he's been smacked by one of the attendants. And then Paul rebukes him and says, if you smack me, God will smack you. Then they said, don't you know he's the high priest? And then Paul says in verse 5, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was the high priest. Because it's written, you shall not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Is that a lie? Paul says, I wist not. What does that mean? I didn't know. Is he lying? Are we not sure? Of course he's lying. He knows who the high priest is. So what does he mean? Now, Paul doesn't lie. Paul is stating a fact. What fact is he stating? He says, that's not the high priest. That's why I can answer him back. And he turns the table around, and the accused becomes the accuser. Isn't it? What's he saying in verse 5? He says, you should not speak evil of your ruler. Who is that? Christ. This is Christ. Christ is the high priest. He says, you should not speak ill of your ruler. That's not going to work. So he comes up with technique number 2. Do we know that Annas, is Annas a Pharisee or a Sadducee? Is Caiaphas a Pharisee or a Sadducee? I'm probably not going to be able to find it quick enough. Let me see if I can find it. Give me one more second. If I can't find it, then I'll paraphrase. I'll try and find it for my next presentation. Alawai identifies, maybe someone else can find it, that Caiaphas is a Pharisee. She actually identifies him as a Pharisee. So maybe someone could search that out. So we know that Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas. So we know Caiaphas is a Pharisee. That's clear. And you can show that Annas was as well. Who? Annas. Oh, show me. Oh, that's what I was looking for. Desire of Ages. 608. Oh, good. The scene passed before the priest's visions. Yeah? Christ's word cut him, the Sadducee, to the quick. Caiaphas had denied the doctrine of the resurrection, the judgment, and the future life. Now he was maddened by satanic fury. Was this man a prisoner before him to assail his most cherished theories? Rending his robe and the people might see his pretended horror, he demanded, without further preliminaries, the prisoner be condemned for blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses, he said. Now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? Oh, good. So he's a Pharisee. Sorry, Sadducee. I keep saying Pharisee. He's a Sadducee. So Paul in verse 5, he's going to say this. Oh, it's not verse 5, verse 6, sorry. But when Paul perceived that one part was Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. So, what's he going to call himself here? He's going to say that he's a Pharisee. And verse 27, there begins to be an argument between these two groups of people, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So in this discussion, Paul identifies himself as a Pharisee. And he says why. Verse 6. Because of the hope of the resurrection, this is why he's being called into question. So does he believe things that Pharisees believe? What's his association to the Pharisees? Is it the law or is it prophecy? Some people say prophecy and some people say the law. He says the hope on resurrection of the dead. That's what the Pharisees being questioned on. Why is he being questioned on that issue? Who's been resurrected? And he's dead. What did it say in verse 4? What's the issue about verse 4 and verse 5? We already said that. Who's the high priest? And who's saying that they're the high priest? Annas, verse 2. Annas is being identified as the high priest because there's no one else that's the high priest. And Paul says no. Who's the high priest? Christ. So why did Paul get smacked? He got smacked because people were questioning what? His belief that Annas is not the high priest, that Christ is. And for that belief or that accusation to be valid, Christ must have resurrected to be a high priest. So that's what he's been attacked on. If we're okay with that. Verse 8. The Sadducees says there's no resurrection, neither angels nor spirits. But the Pharisees confess everything, or both. So Ananias thinks he's the high priest because they have to be people who are alive now. So his association to Pharisees is what issue? It's not an issue of law keeping. It's an issue of prophecy. So when it comes to this side, their problem is what? Their problem is prophecy. So they don't like his prophetic understanding. And so they obviously going to attack him. In that history, who runs the church? Who's running the church in that history? The Sadducees or the Pharisees? So the Sadducees are running the church. If they run the church, if they're up here, why are all the stories about Pharisees and scribes? All the argument and the fighting that Jesus has, why is it with these people? All the arguments and fights, why is it with these people? If the Sadducees rule. Because these arguments the ones that Christ has, are about what? Throughout his ministry. They're all about the law. And they say Jesus is evil or a sinner or wrong. Why? Why is Jesus wrong? Because he's too liberal, he's breaking the law. So the problem in Christ's ministry is that he's too liberal. In fact, what are they going to send him to court for? When he goes to court, on what grounds will he be sent to court? There's two grounds. Church and state. What's the church issue? Blasphemy. That he claims to be like God. Do you think the Sadducees actually care about all of that? So if the Sadducees don't care, how's all this happening? How is he going to be killed by Pharisees if the Sadducees are in charge? We could say that they went into a deal. But why is all the argument in the framework of Pharisees, not in the framework of Sadducees? So, the church at the time of Christ is controlled by the Sanhedrin. The Sadducees are the people who actually rule. The mass of people like you and me. What's their thinking? Are they conservative or liberal in their thinking? Generally speaking. They're generally conservative. And would they listen to the Sadducees? No. The Sadducees know that. So what the Sadducees do is they take the Pharisees and they make them their equal. On one condition. That they can run the church, but they can't make these issues or the differences prominent. They have to tread a very careful line. So the doctrines that are peculiar to Sadducees, they must not be attacking them. So if you're not going to attack the Sadducees, their primary doctrines, what are their primary issues, the Sadducees? Prophecy or law? Prophecy, isn't it? We read it here. We know it's prophecy. It says that what makes you a Sadducee is you don't believe in the resurrection, angels or spirit. So they say, as long as you don't attack our prophecy, you can rule. And the Pharisees agree to that deal. If you don't attack their prophetic model, what are you left with if you're a Pharisee? The law. So their control over the people ends up degenerating into law keeping. And the Sadducees don't care. Just as long as you don't attack their cherished hopes. So, the church is run by the Sadducees, and they hand over all responsibility to the Pharisees. So you have a conservative church. And for them to do that, they have to destroy their understanding of prophecy and say the only thing that makes you a faithful Jewish person is the law or morality. And so then what happens to their prophetic model? Because they can't let go of it. It turns from a spiritual fulfillment to a literal fulfillment. Or what we would call, not the kingdom of heaven, but the kingdom of this world. Kingdom of glory. If you go to chapter 24, Paul is now in Caesarea. He escaped that near-death experience. The scribes and the Pharisees started fighting. The Romans extracted him. They take him to Caesarea for safety, and the Jews pursue him, and then they get into this discussion with the governor. So they have this discussion, and then Paul is allowed to speak. 24:10. Paul begins to speak, and he explains why he went to Jerusalem. Verse 12. I went to Jerusalem to worship, and when I was there, I wasn't causing any trouble, and they took hold of me. And he says, and neither can they prove anything that they're accusing me of now. If you go to verse 5, it tells you what their accusation is. Verse 5 and verse 6. He's a mover of sedition, which means to fight against the government, and he profanes the temple. Verse 14, he says this. 13, he says, everything is a lie, but I believe this. What they call heresy, I call worship. He says, I follow God, the God of my fathers, and I believe everything that was written in the law and in the prophets. And what did the Jews say? They believe everything that was written in the law and the prophets. So what's the discussion or the issue between Paul and the Jews? What was written in the law and the prophets? And what those things look like. How you read. So he says, I follow all the law. I know this is Moses and the prophets. He says, I follow the law, but I also follow the prophets. So it's always about prophecy. This is what his argument always is. He's very liberal in his behavior. And yet, he's also very conservative in his perspective of prophecy. So I like the fact that he uses this argument that he is a Pharisee. This issue between the Pharisees and the Sadducees will continue to grow in importance, in relevance to us. Someone was asking me why I'm talking about this. They said, you must be trying to say something. I guess they know me well enough by now. And without just going straight to the conclusion, which I don't think is ever helpful, I began to explain how God has been leading this movement for a number of years. And what happens is, what God told us 3 years ago, He expects us to remember. Not only remember, He expects us to make the connection between that point and what's going on today. Not only internally, externally, but also in God's Word. And I gave a story this morning about David, Solomon, and David's general. He made an agreement with Solomon, and he didn't really understand the significance of what he was agreeing to. So later on, when he thinks this doesn't look like the agreement, he gets killed. You can see that and remember that story. So we're required to keep track of what's going on in the presentations over the weeks, months and years. Now you might think, how can any person do that? It's too much. It's too difficult. And worse than that, people don't even know the point of the agreement or the point of the study. The problem with all of these arguments that you make, that you're innocent, it's not your fault, is that when God tells us something, He expects us to remember. And sometimes they're decades in the future that we have to remember those things. And unfortunately, remembering is not enough. You have to understand. And too many of us don't actually understand what's going on. But He's good. God is good. Because He does explain. Either that or I'm too weak and I'll explain. In 2016, (9/11), a shaking began in this movement, at least in Europe. It progressed to the glorious land. And what was the argument over? Matthew 13. the wheat and tares. The argument was this. Can we identify the tares? And people would go to SOP quotes and say, no, you can't. And I would go to the parable and say, you can. People would argue, you don't know the heart of a person. And I would argue, you don't know what the root of a tear looks like. And neither do you know what the root of a wheat looks like. How do you identify a plant? By its fruit. Not by its root. So you don't need to know anyone's heart. That's a sentence. You don't need to know anyone's heart. All you need to know is their behavior. The fruit that comes from the heart. Either their words or their actions. People struggle with that. To me it seems really clear. So, when it was taught that you can see a tear, people naturally assumed, what can you see? Who are the good people and who are the bad people in the movement? Because what had just happened recently, people had already begun to leave the movement to fight against us. And in that separation, people would say, oh, this must be the separation of the wheat and tares. And what was the problem with that? Back in 2016, what was the problem with that? Even then, we knew that we hadn't come to the binding off or the harvest or midnight, however you want to say it. So the problem is, we're having a separation before harvest. And people try to do all manner of gymnastics. There was a pre-harvest or a harvest before the harvest. And so once that discussion ensued, it wasn't long before I just left the subject alone. About a year later, I knew that that was wrong. That it was wrong to identify people in our movement as tares. So the question is, why did we think that? Why did we think that you could take this story and bring it to this movement? There was a methodology that made us do that. What was that methodology? Sorry? No. What methodology do you use to allow you to take that and bring it to the movement? Fractals. Good. Jesus says the world. We say the movement. Because we think this movement is the church. So, because we're so brainwashed into fractalizing everything, we take the parable and we fractalize it. So, this was understood to be wrong late 2017, early 2018. And then it was laid out first in November 2018 in Kenya. So there, it was laid out that you cannot fractalize this parable. We know you can't fractalize it because everyone's leaving when? In the Sunday law before harvest, aren't they? They're all leaving in the latter rain. Now this causes problems because is there a model that says people should be leaving from 14 to 19? 14 to 19. Is there a model that says people leave? What period is this? Sorry? Okay, latter rain, Sunday law. What model says that people will leave? You gave the chapter? Chapter 38, great controversy. Another one? Another one? Sunday law. Which verse is this? So which other model do we have? Many overthrown. And who shall come? They shall escape. So is that a fractal? Is that a pure fractal? Yes or no? Yes. You take this big line, the Ellen White talks about these things happening, and we fractalize it down. Who's overthrown? Which group of people? Priests. Who come? Who escape? Priests. They escape from what? Where are priests escaping from? Conservatism?
The same thing, but they said it another perspective, worldliness.
From Laodicea. If you want to be from Adventism. They're escaping from Adventism. It's a lack of understanding of how fractals work that made people think that we said Laodicea equals Babylon. And you can't do that. It's the same mistake. What waymark is this? It's the same logic that says close of probation 2019 is what? And this is not correct. Michael didn't stand up. So people take this large line, when they fractalize it, they make it all exactly the same, and it's not. So that's a separate problem. So we keep on fractalizing everything. And here, 2018, first public statement that says you're not allowed to fractalize. Then December 2019, 6 weeks ago, the same study is done. I think this was a 3-part series, this is a 7-part series. And Matthew 13, 24 to 30 is taught again. And what you're required to do is through 10 hours of material is to glean or distill certain key points. And often it's not going to be given to you because the teachers are mean. Because we want to make it difficult, we don't give all the details. So here, there are some key points. The first major point is you cannot fractalize that parable. And if that's the case, then what impact does that have on this? Is that wrong? Is that wrong then? Because that's fractalized. No, it's not wrong. What you cannot do is when you look at a history, this 5-year history, is to take all your models and bring them together. You must maintain them separate. So one story, this story here about the son-in-law, people leave. You can fractalize that. In fact, if you don't fractalize, you don't even understand what's going on. If you don't fractalize it, you don't know who you were that came in. Because I think this is about 90% of you. There's very few people in this room who actually give the cry of 18:4. 18:4. Then you take another story, Matthew 13, and what does it say here? In this history, what does it say? Sister Emma? What does it say from 14 to 19 in Matthew 13? There's a question that's asked, and the answer begins with no. Matthew 13 says there's no leaving to be done. One story says to leave, and one says no leaving. Which one's correct? Both. Now, how can you get a leaving and a staying if you approach the problem the same way? So you have to approach the problem in a different way. And what you see is that in Matthew 13, in order for the people to stay, you have to refrain from fractalizing. If you fractalized it, who would be a tear? Who would be the premier tear? If you could fractalize it and manipulate the passage. Elder Jeff Pippinger would be the ultimate tear. Future for America, Path of the Just. All of these people that have left, they would all be the tears. The problem is, if they're all tears leaving, that makes this what? Harvest. But the fractal says it's lateral rain. If you don't understand everything I've taught, can you see the problem? Fractal.
Fractal.
14 to 19. Sunday law. Close of probation. Many leave. Edom, Moab and Ammon enter. What Bible passage is this? Daniel 11:41. We have fractalized that. I believe that is correct. Then we get to another one. And this one cannot be fractalized. Is it the same history? Is it the same history? Same history. 14 to 19. So now we're in 14 to 19. Now we could call it Sunday law close probation, but I don't think that would be the right way to approach it. What's this way, Mark? Okay, leave that. What's the Bible verse? Matthew 13. What's this way, Mark? That was close of probation. What's this one? Harvest. Is everybody okay? They're both going to grow together. And what's this way, Mark? This way, Mark, is where the fruit comes up. We'll call it fruit. And this is the latter rain. So what we have are two models of the same history. One is a fractal model and one is a non-fractal model. If we don't recognize this, we end up making mistakes. And not only that, not only will you make mistakes, you won't discover truth or light. How old is all of that? All of this logic, this reasoning. How old is it? It first comes up in 16. By November 18, the logic is already there. By December 19, it's stated openly as a fact. So this model is over 2 years old. I would argue it first begins to be understood early 2018. The whole of 18, the whole of 19, 2 years. So what people have not understood is one of the fundamental building blocks that we need to understand in order to complete our work was understood 2 years ago, was put in the public domain over a year ago, and repeated again 6 weeks ago. And I want to venture that hardly anybody or nobody in at least this group even knew this. When you lay it out now, you say, of course, it's obvious. But it's been there, waiting to be used. Before you can use it, you need to understand it. So this is an important principle that I want all of us to understand. The fractalization of a message and also the non-fractalization of a message. And you have to understand both. Fractalization, what's another word for that? I don't know if I did it here. We did do it here. Scalability. I want to stretch you one more, then we'll close. Fractals, when you start thinking about scalability, what's the other word we could use? Phrase. Another one. I don't want to use that one. That's the right answer, but not that one. No. Repeat and enlarge. I wanted this one because what I want to put here. How new is that? It's not new, it's been around for a very long time. So when we talk about progression, we're talking about the non-fractalization of a model. And when we talk about fractals, repeat and enlarge, we're talking about the fractalization of a model. I want us to become familiar with these, not only the terminology, but the principles. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy. We ask and pray that you would guide, direct and bless us. Help us to understand the truths that you are wanting us to revisit, the truths that we did not have clarity on, but as we review them now, we see that they have been here for many years. We thank you, Lord, that you're bringing light to your people. Whenever we think that there is nothing more to learn, no more to see, you always surprise us with gems of truth that had been buried so deep it was thought impossible to find them. We thank you, Lord, that we can have clarity on this issue in Jesus' name.